Tonight's lecture concerns itself with the Jewish community of Salonika. Salonika was Turkish for most of the time that the Jews lived there, and it became Greek in the 1920s, the early 1920s, when after the First World War, Greece broke off and they took over parts of the Ottoman Empire, and today it is part of Greece. It is on the Gulf of Salonika, and it is a seaport. And that was its main industry, its main commerce was based upon the fact that it was a large commercial seaport that supplied the Adriatic and the Aegean seas. It connected them, and it brought goods from Asia to Europe. Now, the Jewish community in Salonika was very old. We know from Christian sources that the Jews were there in the 2nd and 3rd centuries already, and that there was a large Jewish community. The Christians attempted to convert the Jews and did not meet with much success. The Jews of Salonika were treated very well by the rulers of that part of the world because of the fact that the Jews were a buffer to the Christians. So when the Romans had it, they used the Jews as a buffer against Christian influence. Later, when the Christians took over, the situation of the Jews diminished, but again, there was a great split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And when the Crusaders came in the 11th century and came to allegedly conquer Palestine, so on the way they made war with the Eastern Christians, and they sacked Constantinople. So the Eastern Christians used the Jews as a buffer against the Latin Christians, against the Western Christians, and they gave the Jews special permission, freed them from taxes, gave them commercial rights so that the Western Christians would not take over the commerce of the port, and that it would remain in hands that the emperor felt would be loyal to him. In 1170, the intrepid Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela visited Salonika, and he said there were 500 Jews that were living in Salonika. Now, 500 Jews does not sound like a great deal in our terms, but in terms of the Middle Ages, it was a sizable community because we see he visited communities in Provence that had only 200 Jews. Where the Rivad was in Pasquaires, there were only 40 Jews. So Jews were in small numbers. Probably where Rashi lived in Troyes, there also were not more than 500 Jews. And in Mainz and in Spires and in Worms, that tri-community, that already had about 1,500 Jewish families. But you have to remember that in the 11th century, there were probably no more than 10,000 Ashkenazic Jews in the whole world. And it's from these 10,000 that the great Ashkenazic community developed and spread. And before 1939, there were about 15 million Ashkenazic Jews in the world. A number that we have not been able to make up. Jews came to Salonika from all over. They came from Italy, so that eventually Salonika had what we call Nusach Roma, the Romani liturgy, which is not Sephardic and it's not Ashkenazic. It's a liturgy all unto itself. In Italy today, there still are small Jewish communities that follow the Romani liturgy, but because the Italian Jews were the ones that came in the Middle Ages to Salonika, so therefore they instituted this nusach, this ritual. But the development of Salonika comes after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And the Jews started to arrive in Salonika, Spanish Jews started to arrive in 1453, 40 years before the expulsion itself. And by 1570, 1 century later, there are 20,000 Jews in Salonika, which was 70% of the population of the city. And the city became a Jewish city. The Jews developed the port, so the port of Salonika was closed on Shabbat till the 1900s. And not only the port was closed, all commercial enterprises in Salonika did not operate on Shabbat, because the Jews were the main merchants, the Jews were the bankers, and the Jews were the retailers in town, and therefore everything was closed. Now, we had an analogous situation, believe it or not, the United States of America, regarding Charleston, South Carolina, which also was a great port. It was the entry port in colonial times for the South. And in Charleston, the Sephardic Jews also controlled the port. And the port, therefore, was closed on Shabbat in the 18th century and for a large period in the 19th century. And that also was true in Savannah, Georgia, which also was a port on the Atlantic. Because the Jews were the chandlers, they were the one that sold to the ships, they were the refitters, the suppliers, and they were the customs brokers. They were in the, so to speak, the import-export business. You know what they say about the import-export business is that there's one little box that keeps on traveling around the world. That's the import-export business, and nobody ever opens the box, because if they do, the business is over. So it's just keep on moving the thing all over the world. But the Jews were in Salonika, they were the port. And as we'll see later, the Jews of Salonika became the stevedores here in Haifa and Ashdod. And they're still the port. So in everything that you read about the slowdowns and everything, you'll see from the lecture that's in their blood. That's part of the DNA. And unless you appreciate that and understand it, then you don't understand why they can keep, 40, 60, 80 ships waiting in the harbor while they go to lunch for a week or two. So the Spanish Jews came. The Spanish Jews came with all of their talent. Those that came in 1453 were able to come with their money as well. And after the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 and the expulsion of Jews from Portugal in 1496, Moranos started to come, conversos. In other words, Jews who had converted officially to Christianity in Spain or Portugal, and then they saw the Inquisition was going to destroy them, and they saw they would not be able to have any Jewish life whatsoever, so somehow they escaped to Salonika. And here we have an enormous dispute, as only Jews can have. They come to Salonika, and the Nusach, the liturgy in the synagogue, is Romani, is Italy. That's not their Nusach. Their Nusach is Spain or Portugal. But in Spain and Portugal itself, there are over 30 different Nuschaot, over 30 different liturgies, and which Slichot to say, and which Piyutim to say, and when to say it. So anyone who has been in a synagogue knows that these matters are of great import. People love to dispute regarding them. I have a story that I always tell. I had an uncle, of blessed memory, who was a Slabotka student, and he came to America before the First World War, and he went to medical school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he needed money, and he didn't know what to do, and then he saw an ad in the paper that the state prison system in Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin, needed someone to conduct high holiday services for the Jewish inmates of the jail in Madison. So he applied and he got the job. And he went to conduct the services for the prisoners in the jail. And what happened was, it came Yom Kippur for Mincha, and they were late. So he started to skip some of the piyutim. And a guy got up in the back and said, "What do you think we are here, Reform Jews?" So it's not a light matter to omit the piyut or to include one. And therefore there was a tremendous machlokas in Salonika. And then this machlokas was complicated by the arrival of Ashkenazi Jews. And the Ashkenazi Jews naturally insisted on their liturgy. The Ashkenazi Jews came from Germany and Czechoslovakia. And why did they all come to Salonika? Because in Salonika the Jews had freedom, relatively speaking. From the 1500s, that would be considered freedom. They had an opportunity to make money, and it was a large settled community. And the climate was better than it was certainly in Germany and in Northern Europe. And Jews came. So now you had three distinct communities in Salonika. You had the old Romani community, you had the Spanish-Portuguese community in all of its different forms. You see here that there were 38 Spanish and Portuguese congregations, each of which had its own synagogue and retained its own ritual, rites, and liturgy in 1550. So you had 38 different Sephardic synagogues in Salonika, and everybody's doing their own thing. The Ashkenazim, who were smaller in number, only had 6 synagogues. The old Romani had over 20 synagogues. So you're talking in this community over 60 synagogues. And I mean, if you think 60 synagogues are bad, you had 60 rabbis who also didn't always see eye to eye. And you had some of the great Gaonim of Spain, before they went elsewhere, came to Salonika. For instance, Rabbi Levi ibn Chaviv, the Ralbach, who later would become the chief rabbi here in Yerushalayim, and who would be the main opponent of Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Yaakov Beirav in the dispute over the smicha to renew the Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Yaakov Beirav and Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted to renew the Sanhedrin, and they were located in Tzfat. And Rabbi Levi ibn Chaviv, who was located here in Yerushalayim, opposed it for various reasons, and his opposition was so strong that the plan never could be effectuated. It died within one generation. But he was originally a Rav in Salonika in the Spanish congregations. There also was a famous Rav, Rab Shmuel di Modena, the Marashdam, who was a great Rav and a great Gaon. We have many Shilas and Shuvas, many responsive from him. And he built a big yeshiva, so that not only a big yeshiva in terms of numbers, but in terms of quality. Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, Dan Isaac Abarbanel sent his son Shmuel to study in Salonika in the yeshiva, because he felt that that was the best yeshiva that existed at the time. So Salonika became a center of Torah, and it became a center of Jewish commerce, and it also became a center of Jewish printing. In Christian Europe, after the printing press came into being in the middle of the 15th century, so the Jews naturally were interested in printing because of their love of books and because of the fact that printing was, in their time, I guess what the computers has been in our time. It was a complete revolution in how people could study and how things could be disseminated. You didn't have to copy things by hand, and you could make books in many copies. It was a complete breakthrough in the mentality of Europe. Now, the church was afraid of the printing press. And the church, therefore, controlled the printing press to the extent that you couldn't own a printing press, or you couldn't print without their approval. It had to have the imprimatur of the church on the flyleaf in order to have it. And Jews were not allowed in Christian Europe to own a printing press. So therefore what the Jews had to do was use non-Jewish printing presses as the front for them. And we find that in the first century of printing, most of the Hebrew books are printed by non-Jewish printers. But in Salonika, which was under the control of the Turks, under the Muslim emperors, because as I mentioned before, it was part of Turkey, there the Jews could own printing presses. The Jews could print whatever they wanted. And therefore, there was, in the 1500s, it was a center of Jewish printing. There were 4 different Jewish printing presses based in Salonika. Many Sforim were printed in Salonika. And the Chumoshim, Sidurim, all sorts of things. Salonika became the center, a great center of Jewish knowledge because of the yeshiva and because of the fact that it had the printing press located in Salonika, and you could pretty much do whatever you wanted to. In 1545, there was a great fire in Salonika that burned down the whole town. 8,000 houses and 18 synagogues were destroyed in the fire. But the Jews in Salonika, and the fire was not arson, it was just the type of housing that people had, thatched roofs, flammable material, and the houses were built very close together, dense, so that if a fire occurred, in Eastern Europe, fires happened on a regular basis. Volozhin burned down about 4 times in the history of the yeshiva. The Chafetz Chaim writes about Radin that he was so proud that finally he was able to raise money to build a brick building so that it wouldn't burn down as all the other buildings burned down. And it didn't take much for it to burn. A spark, a wind, lightning, and the whole town went. So Salonika burned down in 1545. The Jews rebuilt it in 2 years. And the commerce of Salonika reached its height to the extent that Salonika was the most profitable customs port in the Turkish Empire. So the Turkish Sultan was very interested that the Jews should be successful because of the fact of the enormous income that they brought in. Because what happened was that a boat came from Asia, let's say, and docked in Salonika. Then that was the cargo was transferred to another boat that would take it further in the Mediterranean, or would take it to European ports. So then you had to pay customs. And the Jews were the customs brokers. They took for themselves and they took for the Turkish emperor. And they were the ones that organized this entire business so that the wealthy Jews owned the business. The poorer Jews had jobs. They were the stevedores. They were the loaders and the unloaders. They were the schleppers. But everybody had a job, and the community was seen as a wealthy and strong community. In the 1500s, there was a great Jewish woman by the name of Donna Gracia Beatrice Mendes, who she was a Portuguese, she was baptized as a Marano, as a converso, but when she grew up, she and her husband escaped, and they became, it's really a forerunner of the Rothschilds. Through their cleverness and their financial acumen, they became the financiers of the Turkish emperor. Now, kings, emperors always need money. No matter how much they have, it's not enough. And therefore, they became very wealthy. Her husband died, and unlike most widows of the time, or most women of the time, she did not retire, but she took over the business, and she was a better businesswoman than he was. And she built an enormous empire, an absolutely enormous empire of wealth, throughout the Mediterranean. She had a nephew that she took into the business. His name was Don Joseph Naxos. He was there was an island in the Mediterranean, Naxos, which he owned. Don Joseph Naxos, together with Donna Grazia Beatrice Mendez, bought the city of Tiberias, the city of Tiberia, from the Sultan of Turkey in the 1500s. And they established a Jewish state. And they put out an announcement that all the Jews should come and move to Tiberias, to the land of Israel. And they had in mind that Tiberias would link up with Tzfat, with Safed, which had a large Jewish population and had great Gaonim, and that this would be, so to speak, the beginning of the return to Zion. But we all know that the Jews are always hesitant to grasp opportunities when it comes to the land of Israel. So they didn't get many Jews that came. And those that came, it's really the story of the Baron Rothschild. Those that came didn't expect to work. They said, we're coming, you know, let Don Joseph Naxos support us. Let Beatrice Gracia Mendez support us. Why should we have to work? It's enough that we came. And so after 70 years, the whole thing petered out, and the Turks took back the city. But it's a fact in Jewish history that there was a Jewish state already. But it never got off the ground. There was another great port in Italy called Ancona. And that port was also controlled by Jews. And it was a rival to Salonika, a commercial rival to Salonika. A new pope came, and his goal, his ideal was that he was going to convert all of the Jews of Europe to Christianity. And he was going to begin with Ancona. And he therefore forced the Jews to give up their businesses. He forced them, many of them, to convert at the threat of death. Missionary priests spoke in the synagogue, and the Jews had to come and listen. And there was a pogrom in Ancona. So Donna Grazia Beatrice Mendez organized a boycott of Ancona. And she spoke to all the Jewish merchants in Salonika and in the other ports of the Mediterranean that no one should load ships going to Ancona. And this was her attempt to, so to speak, break the power of the church, at least as far as Jews were concerned. I would say that this is probably the earliest or maybe the only attempt of a mass Jewish protest against the activities of the church during the Middle Ages or the early modern era. In fact, we've never tried anything like it since. And it failed because the Jewish merchants refused to boycott. So here you have the question which always exists. A boycott is a double-edged sword. And we've never been able to figure out whether it's good or it's not good. For instance, in the 1930s, there was an attempt in the United States by the Jewish community to boycott German goods as a protest against Hitler. And again, there was a great split in the Jewish world whether or not to do so or not, because many said it'll only make it worse. In fact, that was Hitler said that Kristallnacht was the response of the German masses to the Jewish boycott of Germany. So do boycotts work or don't they work? Well, they make you feel better, that I'll tell you. But whether or not that truly is effective has always been a matter of debate, and I don't think the debate has ever been settled. Nevertheless, the The fact that the boycott at Ancona did not work, and it did not work mainly because the Jews did not support it, weakened the position of Donna Grazia. She dies soon afterwards, and then her nephew, when he dies, and that whole empire begins to just fades away, and we never had anyone like it take it up again. She died in 1569. Now, Salonika is also famous or infamous for the fact that it was the center of the belief in Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, appears on the scene a century after Donna Grazia, in the 1650s. And he says he's the Messiah. And Jews believed him. Now, as dangerous as boycotts are, Messianism is even more dangerous. And the Jewish experience with Messianism has been very, very sad and tragic. That's why I always maintain that, you know, when the Messiah comes tomorrow, he's going to have a job convincing us. Because we've been burned so many times. In Yiddish, there's a phrase that if you burn yourself on hot soup, then you blow even when you're eating cold soup. And we've been burned many, many times. Now, Shabtai Tzvi, it's estimated that a third of the Jewish people believed in him. Many great rabbis believed in him. To the extent that rabbis who opposed him were driven out of their communities, were subjected to all sorts of slander. One cannot really imagine the effect that Shabtai Tzvi had. And it was only when Shabtai Tzvi was forced by the Turkish emperor. I mean, the emperor went along with it for a while because it brought him in money. But when the charade became too obvious, so then he gave Shabtai Tzvi the choice of either converting to Islam in a public fashion, or he would kill him. And Shabtai Tzvi converted. So now you have a Messiah that became an apostate, became a Meshumad, converted to Islam. Shabtai Tzvi had a great publicity man. Every Messiah needs a publicity man. You can't do it without PR. So Jesus had Paul, right? Without Paul, there would be no Christianity today. Shabtai Tzvi had a man called Nathan of Gaza. Natan Ha'azati, not Nathan of Gaza. Now, whether or not, it's not clear to us whether initially they believed in this thing, you know, or whether they were just con men. But the fate of all con men is that they con themselves. Eventually, you believe your own lies. And Nathan was the one that publicized Shabtai Tzvi throughout the world. He's the one that sent out missives and all sorts of messages. Now that he became a Muslim, so Nathan said, now is the test of the true believer. Because now only the true believers will still believe in him, and those are the ones that will be privileged to see the Messianic era, and those that deny him are all gone. So we also have experience with that type of phenomenon in the Jewish world today, where even though, nevertheless, you have to believe. And it's the test of the true believer against all facts. This Shabtai Tzvi followers had a great center in Salonika. And Salonika, in fact, not only was a great center of Shabtai Tzvi activity, but they became like crypto-Jews because the main Jewish community now rejected them and demanded that they give it up, so they went underground. And they existed underground for over 200 years. Secret Shabtai Tzvi Jews. And they called themselves the Ma'aminim, they were the believers, the true believers. They called themselves Chaverim, they were the friends, the associates of themselves. They were the Balei Milchama, those who fought the war of justice. And they took for themselves the name of Donmeh, which meant that they were considered to be apostates. And they said that the other Jews were called Kofrim. They were the ones who denied. And this had a serious effect in Salonika because of the fact that you had this underground group that undermined the authority, certainly of the rabbis, but undermined the Jewish community continually, both within the Jewish community and in representing themselves to the Turkish authorities who still ran the community. Because of this Shabtai Tzvi affair, for about 10, 12 years, the port of Salonika was like paralyzed because of the fact that the Jews didn't know what to do. There were Jewish businesses that sold their business because they were certain that the Messiah was here, so therefore they were going to leave. So they sold their businesses, they sold their homes. There were those that wouldn't load ships because they need the ships to bring all the Jews to the land of Israel. And then you had partnerships, because Jews always had partnerships. That one partner was a Sabbatean and one was not. And they couldn't get along. And they wouldn't speak to each other. And therefore the commercial trade suffered greatly as a result of the Shabtai Tzvi debacle. And Salonika began to decline. And it would decline imperceptibly at first, but it would decline steadily until the end. It never again reached the heights that it did in the late 1500s and early 1600s in terms of its commercial strength and value, and in terms of the Jewish community. Even though the Jewish community would grow and grow and grow, by 1919, there were about 95,000 Jews in Salonika. And at the beginning of the First World War in 1939, there were 65,000 Jews in Salonika. And again, they were 50% of the population. So Salonika remained a Jewish city because where the Jews are that numerous in a city, even if they be not the majority, it becomes a Jewish city because of the Jewish influence that exists in all areas of life. In Salonika, the spread of Kabbalah also took place. And it was a Kabbalistic center. Kabbalah became very popular, certainly amongst the Sephardic Jews, the Mediterranean Jews. And it took on a Kabbalistic rhythm, so to speak, that wasn't found necessarily in other places in Europe. By the way, the crypto-Jews, to show their belief in Shabtai Tzvi, themselves converted to Islam and then remained Jews secret in the cellar because they wanted to imitate Shabtai Tzvi. They wanted to show that that's how it was supposed to be done. So to us, all of this sounds wild, except that we know that it could happen today too. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire began to crumble. It was called the sick man of Europe. It was corrupt beyond all corruption until until our neighbors taught them new heights in corruption. But it became extremely corrupt, and it became extremely disorganized, hard to govern. And in the 19th century, the spirit of nationalism took over. So that, for instance, the Greeks no longer wanted to live under Turkish rule. And the Armenians didn't want to live under Turkish rule. All of the countries that are carved out of the Ottoman Empire today had ethnic groups within them, the Kurds, others that wanted to be independent, that didn't want to be under Muslim Turkish rule, and therefore you had this fragmentation of society and the inability of the Turks to really control their empire anymore. Part of this is caused by Western ideas that come. Now, in the 19th century, there was a war between Greece and Turkey. There was a Greek rebellion. Lord Byron participated in it. The Greeks were the heroes of the Western world. And they became the cause of all the intellectuals in Europe. We know that when intellectuals in Europe choose a cause, it usually is the wrong one. But in that time, that was the cause of Greek independence. It was also the time when England, Britain ruled, Britannia ruled the waves, and the British Navy, it was the height of the British Empire. It was under Disraeli and Gladstone, and that was the time when Lord Elgin took the frieze off of the Parthenon and moved it to London, where they built in the British Museum a special wing called the British Marbles. The United States marbles is something else. Marbles is a game of little glass beads that you play, children play. And so therefore, when you say in the United States, I went to see the Elgin marbles, they look at you like you're out of your mind. But we all know that the English language, Winston Churchill said that the United States and England are divided by a common language. And so this is only one example of it. But the Elgin marbles are the frieze of the great Parthenon in Athens, which was taken to England. Greece is constantly demanding its return, but England somehow is not willing to accommodate them. In any event, Western ideas came with the British, with the French, with everyone. And there was an organization led by Adolphe Crémieux, who has a street named after him in the German colony, called the Alliance Israelite Universal, the Universal Kol Yisrael Chaverim was its Hebrew name. And this French-based institution created Jewish schools throughout the world. They created Jewish schools here in the land of Israel, but especially they concentrated in the Muslim countries, in the Mediterranean countries, in Morocco and Algeria, even in Iraq, in Egypt, and they concentrated in Salonika. And in Salonika they opened a number of schools. They began in 1873. By 1878, they had over 8 schools operating, and the wealthy Jews sent their children to these schools, because in these schools you studied French, they had secular studies. The schools were not anti-religious, but the schools were not in the tradition of the Torah schools which existed in the community. So therefore, in almost all Jewish communities, if you sent your child to the Alliance school, so that meant, you know, that you weren't going to get Mafter Yonah in the synagogue anymore. It was a statement. In retrospect, the Alliance schools were very mild. And they taught a great deal of Hebrew studies, of Torah, They were run mostly by religious Jews. So if we look at it, over a century later, we may have less of a jaundiced view of them than what existed when they came in. But everyone saw that they were the ones that were bringing Western ideas, Western culture into these Jewish communities. And in Salonika, that led to a weakening of tradition, weakening of the role of the rabbi, a weakening of observance. And the Alliance schools were followed by Zionism. Salonika was one of the few places in the Mediterranean basin where Zionism was very, very strong. Before the First World War, before the Second World War, I'm sorry, over 20,000 Jews from Salonika had come to Israel to settle. In fact, the founder of the Israel Discount Bank, he was a Salonican Jew, Rakanti. And other major banking and industrial firms here in Israel that were created in the 1920s and 1930s were created by Jews from Salonika. And as I mentioned, the stevedores started to come also, and were very active in the ports. They went back into the port business. In 1911, in Salonika, there still were 37 synagogues and a complete range of Jewish infrastructure. There was an old age home, a Jewish hospital. In fact, there were the beginnings of a Jewish medical school. There was an almshouse for the poor. There was a achnosat orchim, a place for travelers to stay. All of these services was a complete Jewish community. And it seemed like Salonika would remain forever. Two things happened that changed the entire situation. First thing was the First World War. The First World War is undoubtedly the greatest disaster because of the fact that it led to all the other disasters in the 20th century. And it was a war that 4 years into the war, no one figured out why there was such a war. What was the purpose? But the purpose was certainly to bring down the Ottoman Empire. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was destroyed, and the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. When the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, so there was a revolution in Turkey. And Kemal Atatürk, who was the general of the Turkish army that defeated the British at Gallipoli in the First World War, became the ruler of Turkey. Now, he was a dictator. But he created modern-day Turkey so that even today when you go to Turkey, his picture is there, wherever you go. And Ataturk imposed a secular government on a Muslim population. And if you go to Turkey today, you can see it. I mean, no one is allowed to go in the streets in religious dress. So all the Rabbonim in Turkey go with baseball caps. Because if we can't wear a black hat on the street, it's not allowed. The police will come over to you. And the Muslims are not allowed to go in Muslim dress. Now, in Constantinople, there are enormous, Istanbul, there are enormous mosques dating back to the 14th century, but there are modern mosques, they're tremendous mosques, and there's freedom of religion, but you can't practice it publicly. And for instance, the Jewish schools cannot teach Hebrew. So you have this anomaly, this strange situation. Now, after the First World War, Greece and Turkey fought very, very bitterly, a bitter, bitter war, and that's why that animosity between Greece and Turkey remains until today. You know, the island of Cyprus is split. Greece and Turkey don't get along. And what happened was that Ataturk took 2 million Greeks and kicked them out of Turkey. Just 2 million people, he threw them out. Just as the Turks massacred 1.5 million Armenians. And the Greeks were thrown into Greece. And many of them came to Salonika. The Greek government wanted to break the Jewish hold on Salonika. They wanted to make it a Greek city. And to do so, they imposed a punitive series of taxes on Jewish businesses, which destroyed the Jewish businesses. And they forced Jews to sell real estate and businesses and commercial enterprises to the Greeks. They passed a law that everybody has to be closed on Sunday. No business to be done on Sunday, which in effect damaged only the Jews, because now those that observed Saturday, so they were closed 2 days a week, and you're not talking a time of a 5-day week as we are today, and that brought serious, serious harm to the Jews in Salonika. And they were openly anti-Semitic, the Greek government. They said that they wanted to Hellenize Salonika. They wanted to rid it of its cosmopolitan ambience, which was a code word for Jews. And then they said they wanted to get rid of all of the socialists and the communists, which again was a code word for Jews, and there were many Jews who were in the Greek socialist and communist camp. Because of all of this, there was a pogrom in 1930 in Salonika where Jewish businesses and homes were destroyed while the police stood idly by and watched it happen. So that the Jewish population, as I mentioned, began to take the hint and started to leave. So from 95,000 before the First World War, by 1939, there only were 65,000 left. The end of Salonika is really a very, very sad chapter. Greece was invaded by Italy, by Mussolini, and the Italian army performed very, very badly. The Greeks held them up. The British rushed troops to support the Greeks, and Italy suffered a severe defeat. Hitler could not bear that his ally Mussolini should be so humbled. By the way, all of this was before the invasion of Russia, and therefore many historians feel that Greece and Yugoslavia, these two campaigns that the Germans engaged in early 1940, in late 1940 and early 1941, is really what cost Germany the war against Russia, because they couldn't invade Russia now until the end of June of 1941. Originally they were supposed to invade in March, and if they would have invaded in March, they would not have had the winter in front of Moscow in November 1941 that stopped them, because they would have been there 2 months earlier. So that's part of the what if. But in any event, Germany sent its troops in, and Germany defeated the British. The British suffered a stinging defeat. The island of Crete fell. In 1941, the SS shows up in Salonika. Now, in Salonika, there was a rabbi. Let me get his name so that we have it correctly. He was an Ashkenazic rabbi who was elected only in 1940. He was elected, Koretz was his name. Dr. Tzvi Koretz. He was elected because of his education. He was a doctor. And he was taken by the Germans, and they took him to Vienna, and he came back 6 weeks later, and he became the head of the Jewish community in Salonika. And he assured the Jews that everything was going to be all right, and that if the Jews would only follow his instructions, then they would be spared, and they'd be able to ride out the war. Without judging him, because who can judge under such circumstances, and who knows what they told him in Vienna and what his choices were. But this was the pattern of the Germans, wherever they went, is that they got the Jews literally to do their dirty work for them. They got the Jews, they made a Judenrat, they made the Jewish council, they appointed Jews. So you have the man that was in Lodz, who left his famous diaries, and in every Jewish community throughout Europe where the Germans came, they followed the same procedure. So here they took Koretz, and by 1943, the Jewish community was completely impoverished. All their money had been taken from them. All of their businesses had been taken from them. They were subsisting on a very, very minimal ration. So even though the regular Greeks didn't wallow in a lot of food, but they had a lot more food than the Jews. The Jews had half the rations that the Greek population had. And Jews began to die of malnutrition and disease. By the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, the Nazis began their selections. Thousands of Jews were taken. Almost the whole city of Salonika, there were only 1,200 Jews that survived out of the 65,000. And they were all sent to Auschwitz. In fact, the only part of the Holocaust that really affected Sephardic Jewry was the story of the Jews in Salonika. They were taken away, and they were shipped to Auschwitz. Most of them were destroyed on the day that they came. In all of Greece, there were only 15% of the Jews survived. And in Salonika, the number was even less. Salonika was called the Jerusalem of the Balkans, just as Vilna was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And the remnants of the Jews of Salonika, with the exception of about 40 families, attempted to come to Israel. Now, there was a British blockade of Israel in 1946 and 1947. The blockade was pretty much successful. Over 90% of all the shipping was intercepted, and they were either sent back to the ports where they came from, or they were interned in Cyprus. There was only one ship that made a fight of it. In November 1945, there was a ship named the Beryl Katzenellensen, named after the famous labor Zionist leader. Two British frigates pulled up along the ship and demanded, as they demanded in all the other ships, that the Jews surrender themselves. But this ship was full of longshoremen, stevedores from Salonika. And they rammed the two British frigates. They ran their boat into the British boats. And then they stood at the deck. I want to read to you. They stood at the desks with iron pipes and crowbars, and the implacable promise of death in their eyes. After 90 minutes of tense standoff, the British warships and its Marines suddenly reversed course. The Barrow Katzenelison then proceeded towards the coast of Israel. Its passengers had awaited no further assurance of deliverance. Achieving the Holy Land on their own, this time they were redeeming themselves. It was the only ship that fought, and it was the only ship that got through in that fashion. And you can meet their descendants, you can probably meet some of them as well, but they're in Jaffa and in Ashdod and in Haifa in the ports. So as he himself describes them, rough, coarse, difficult people from the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Because of what they went through and because of their experiences. Today, there are, as I mentioned, there are about 40 Jews left in Salonika. And there's one synagogue, and Salonika is over, at least as far as the Jewish community is concerned. Most of the people there, almost all of them, are of advanced age already, and time and attrition will take its course and end the community. But here was this great community, the Jerusalem of the Balkans, that had existed for millennia, from the 2nd century on, and had produced what it produced, and it was such a great community, but the exile closed in on it. There are synagogues of Salonican Jews all over the land of Israel. Even here in Yerushalayim, there is a synagogue of their Nusach, and they, as I mentioned, they have adapted themselves to our country, and they have brought with them much of what they were in Salonika, but the Salonican Jewish community, as it was known, no longer exists in the world. Thank you for coming out on such a night.